Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming and braving the weather. My name is Sean Easton. I'm with the Classics Department here at Gustavus. On behalf of the generous sponsors of this talk, the Gustavus Adolphus Lecture Series, the Classics Department, the Diversity Center, the English Department, the Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies Program, the Modern Languages Department, and the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Patrice Rankine. Professor Rankine received his Ph.D. in 1998 from Yale University, and in that year began teaching at Purdue, where he is now Associate Professor of Classics, Comparative Literature, and Philosophy and Literature, and is also approaching the midway point in his term as Assistant Head of the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature. Professor Rankine's talk this evening reflects his long-held enthusiasm for the relationships between Greek and Roman antiquity and the cultures of the world, both ancient and modern. During his time as director of Purdue's Interdisciplinary Studies program, Professor Rankine organized a series of lectures examining the intersections between Greek and Roman classics and women's studies, Asian studies, and African American studies. In this last category, among numerous talks and articles, Professor Rankine has himself made one of the signal contributions in modern scholarship with his widely praised book, Ulysses in Black, Ralph Ellison, Classicism, and African American Literature, available at the Gustavus Library. Professor Rankine has, for several years, been working in the sphere of Latin American diaspora culture issues, and it is one of the products of that research that it is our good fortune to hear this evening. After the talk is over, there will be a brief question and answer session, which you're invited to stay for if you are able, and a reception here in the hall. Please join me in welcoming Professor Patrice Rankine.
I don't think I've ever been to an academic audience that's this enthusiastic. Thank you for a really nice introduction, a really energetic crowd. Maybe it's the snow, I don't know. I'm glad you didn't choose to go home early or any other thing you could be doing tonight. I'm glad you're here. I'm happy to be here. Thanks to Professors Easton and Hong and McEwen and all of the other faculty members that I've been able to meet and spend some time with, and had a nice dinner this evening, which I told Professor McHugh organized and picked the menu, and it's just lovely, really nice. Well, the introduction is kind of tough for me because one of the problems with academia is that we tend to, as scholars, pick very narrow areas of focus, and we tend to ask to continue to do research and publish in that small area. So, for example, my Ph.D. dissertation was on Seneca's tragedies. Seneca, the 1st century AD Roman philosopher and poet. And none of my work since the dissertation has been on Seneca. I have a very small section in my book of Ulysses in Black, which Professor Easton mentioned, on Seneca. But I tend to be really promiscuous intellectually. I like to fool around in other people's fields and see what other people are doing and kind of play the field a bit intellectually. And in scholarship, that's kind of dangerous because the people who are experts in particular fields guard it pretty well. I mean, they've spent their lives in these fields, they've spent their research careers developing expertise, and it's one has to approach other fields humbly. And it's that in that spirit that I approach Latin American studies, studies in Brazil, and African diaspora studies, because they're not my expertise. My expertise are in the classics, and it's only as an interloper that I'm able to spend some time looking at other fields and thinking about connections between my field and others. So tonight, I just really want to look at a very kind of narrow area of this work, Black Athena, which I'll tell you a little bit about for those who haven't gotten a chance to read it, who don't know about it, or even faculty members who haven't visited in a while. The work was published 20 years ago, a little bit over 20 years ago. So it's a work that's kind of come and gone and has come back since Professor Bernal has published a 3rd volume of Black Athena in 2006. So it's a work that spans really 2 decades of American life. And I want to tell you a little bit about it and look at it from a specific perspective. Perspective is really about the idea of origins. And even at dinner last night, it was interesting to me thinking about the talk and having dinner with folks I haven't spent too much time with, a little bit of time, but met Virgil Jones last night. And one of the first things we all talked about were issues of origins. Where are you from? Where were you born? Where's your family from? And it's really striking to me that we continue to, even in introducing ourselves and talking about our own lives, we continue to think in terms of origins, where we're from. It seems somehow that these issues of origin affect or influence where we think we are in the present or where we think we're going in the future. So the aim tonight is really to argue that perceptions, that is cultural perceptions, personal perceptions, national perceptions of where we originate have a profound impact on how we constitute our present and our future. I'm interested in how stories of origins influence national and group identities in the US and Brazil, particularly as they pertain to the idea of African and non-African origins. The question of origin has a profound impact not only on the construction of Black identities in the US and Brazil, but also it influences national cultures in Brazil and in the US as well. Now, again, doing this as an interloper, what does a classicist have to do with African American origins and origins in the US or Brazil? I think it's kind of core to what a classicist does that we're concerned with origins. If you think about what scholars in the classics do, what is the origin of democracy? What was the first democracy? And how do we view this democracy? How are we similar or different from this democracy? Why are we even interested in Athenian democracy, for example? Or even the broad study of sexuality that emerged in the classics. When I was in grad school, really, if you weren't doing sexuality when I was in grad school, you weren't doing classics, right? People were really interested in the way that Greeks and Romans constructed their sense of self around gender, right? What does it mean to be a woman, or even in particular a Roman man? I mean, I think of Craig Williams' Roman homosexualities, which I assigned in a graduate course this semester to kind of hone in on this point of what people were doing in the 80s and 90s in classics. And it's really striking when we read that in class, how detailed Craig Williams is, right? Foucault says that there is a kind of repressive model of sexuality that we've kind of moved away from. Well, Craig Williams proved that in this book. If you look at his chapter on sexual practices in Rome, it's right down to the gory detail. Who's penetrating whom? How are they penetrated? And we can go on and on. And, just right down to very detailed and minute categories of people, right? People who only are penetrated, or people who only penetrate. Really sort of minute issues about sexuality. But that's what classicists do, right? We're interested in Roman sexuality and Greek sexuality. Same thing with theater. And I can go on and on, right? In any number of the fields that we think about in the classics, at some point we're concerned with origins. So in that regard, I guess it's not so far-fetched for a classicist to begin to think about what that means in a broader context of American society, and then if you travel a bit in places like Brazil. I think that Bernal's work, and I'll tell you a little bit about Bernal's work in a moment, but I think Bernal's work, despite this broader issue of the concern with classics, in the classics of origins, I think his work kind of shifted the paradigm a bit. It shifted our field in a lot of ways. It shifted, really, the questions we ask. What questions do classicists ask? What are our broader concerns? And also, who asks the questions? We find that people outside of the field of classics, through Bernal, became extremely interested in the field. Right? So Bernal had a real impact in reshaping how we look at the field. So my assertion that notions of origins help us to shape our sense of self might seem elementary to a lot of people in the audience, yet scholars call into question the very obsession with origins that Martin Bernal seek to provoke and to answer. Why were origins so important to him? Right? Why was Bernal so concerned with origins? So I'm interested in creating a relationship between Bernal and discussions of race outside of the US, and yet the assertion that Bernal influences Brazilian discourse is a misnomer, right? I will not tonight argue that Bernal had a direct impact on discourses of origin in Brazil, of cultural and racial origin in Brazil. What I will try to do is situate Bernal into a broader context of that discourse in the US and Brazil. He did have a direct impact on these questions in the States. I don't believe that's the case in Latin America. So, if I can find a little pointer thingy. And I know a lot of the texts that I'm going to show you are kind of too small for you to be able to read, but Professor Easton asked me if I can share copies of the PowerPoint, and I will. So you'll have copies of these PowerPoints from today and tomorrow. Bernal's general thesis, right, was that there are two models, two views of how we approach the ancient world. One he called the ancient model, and the other the Aryan model. And I just quote from the first page of Bernal here to show you what he was doing in this volume. He says these volumes, he begins in 87, and from the very outset he says that he's going to write 3 volumes. I think at one point he was talking about 4 volumes of works concerned with classical origins of Greece in the ancient world, African origins, what he calls Afro-Asiatic roots of classical Greece. And the first volume was to look at archaeology, or actually the history of the classics in 18th and 19th century European thought. The second volume was to look at archaeology. And the third volume, which was just published in 06, was to look at linguistic evidences for what he was arguing. And he says these volumes of Black Athena are concerned with 2 models of Greek history. One viewing Greece as essentially European or Aryan, the other seeing it as Levantine, on the periphery of the Egyptian and Semitic cultural area. I call them Aryan and ancient models. Now watch this. The ancient model was the conventional view among Greeks in the classical and Hellenistic world. So he tells you that he's laying out these 2 volumes, but what does that last sentence do? It shifts the scales, right? And what he wants to tell you is that this ancient model is the conventional view held in Greece. So he's giving a kind of priority to what he's calling the ancient model. And what he'll now do from page 1 on is to construct this ancient model, to tell you a bit about what it was, and then to show you why he feels this model was destroyed in the 18th and 19th century by European scholars, right? So he sets it out from the very beginning. He weighs it, and in doing so, he wants to give a priority to the way the ancients saw themselves. If Greeks saw themselves as originating from Egypt, then why should we not feel the same way? Note that even in this first volume, he was already beginning to construct Egypt as black, right? If we think of Egypt even today, we think of North Africa, we separate that from sub-Saharan Africa. We don't think of Egypt as a Negroid or an African in terms of color, in terms of blackness. We don't think of Egypt as a black country, so to speak. But it's interesting because this flyer, African Athena, is a flyer that was put together by the person who organized this conference this past year in Warwick, England. And what we learned is that African Athena was to be the original title of the work, right? That Bernal's idea was to talk about Africa generally. And it wasn't until he went to his publisher in the United States, Cornell University Press, I think was the first publisher who viewed this work. They told him that the work would sell better in the States if he named it Black Athena, right? So already there was a recognition that this work was going to have an impact and resonance within the United States, within North America, that it might not have elsewhere. And that if he were to title it African Athena, he might not get the audience that he initially would get here. And it was true, right? The work made a splash within the United States. So what is this ancient model as Bernal saw it? I draw these images to show how self-evident in a lot of ways this model was. That Bernal, what he was saying is that if you just look at the artifacts, just look at the evidence, the preponderance of evidence tells you that Greece emerges out of a Near Eastern context. It sees itself as connected to this Near East. Its artifacts, its ways of life, its rituals are connected to this Near East, right? So if you look at, for example, the Sphinx, here is Oedipus with the Sphinx on the left-hand side, and here's the Great Sphinx in Giza. And the idea here is that if you just look at these images, we understand that a Sphinx has a Near Eastern origin, right? It's not something that the Greeks invented. It's not a European, so to speak, concept, that is right there for everyone to see, right? And so Bernal went on and on. The Sphinx would be one example. Greek myths all told stories of connections to Egypt and to North Africa. The one that immediately comes to mind would be the myth of Danaus, who was an offspring of Io, right? The woman who Zeus is in love with, and he's, again, promiscuous and messing around with Io. Hera is about to catch him. He transforms Io into a heifer, and Hera sees this. She castigates Io. Io travels to Egypt, and there has offspring, right? That offspring leads to Danaus. Danaus has a brother, Gyptus. Gyptus has 50 sons. Danaus has 50 daughters, and there's somehow a conflict between these two. They're supposed to marry. Danaus doesn't want this to happen. He leaves and travels back to Greece, to Argos, Danaus does, and has the daughters there, all 49 out of the 50 daughters kill off their cousins, I guess, right? If you think of Adolphus' sons. So what's the idea here? Again, it's a myth about travel, about migration, and it's a myth that shows, according to Bernal, a certain connection between North Africa, in this case Egypt, and Greece, right? The examples would abound. I mean, if you look at one example I really like is from Plato's Phaedrus, the story of the god Theos, who invents writing. He gives writing to the king Daunus, and Plato, Socrates in the dialogue argues that writing becomes a pharmacon. That is, it's a drug, that it leads to forgetfulness, right? That we can't remember anymore, that the poets like Homer held all this information in their heads. They were able to recite poems, but writing does away with that. But on the one hand, it's an aid of memory, and on the other hand, it effaces memory. So Socrates' examples there are again Egyptian, right? That it's an Egyptian invention, writing. And I could go on, right, for days. That there are all these examples of connections between the ancient Near East, North Africa, Egypt, and Greece. I mean, something so self-evident, you wonder why Bernal felt that it was necessary to write such a work. Well, the answer there is in the Aryan model. Bernal says that these questions of origin, the idea that Greece had its origin in the Near East, that it understood its connection to Egypt, was lost in the 18th and 19th century, and he links this directly to European racism. This was probably the most incendiary aspect of his work, of Bernal's work, because he went, the term is off the hook, right? He went berserk in terms of how many European scholars he indicted for racism. Great European greats, people like Hegel and Hume, were all indicted. And I'll just read you this quote quickly. He says, to recapitulate, it is certain that Locke and most 18th century English-speaking thinkers like David Hume and Benjamin Franklin were racist. I mean, that's broad. To say that most 18th century English-speaking thinkers were racist is quite an indictment. He says they openly expressed popular opinions that dark skin color was linked to moral and mental inferiority. In Hume's case, racism so transcended conventional religion that he was a pioneer of the view that there is not one creation of man, but many different ones, because such a uniform, constant difference could only happen in so many countries and ages if nature had not made an original distinction betwixt breeds of men. The centrality of racism to European society after 1700 is shown in the fact that this polygenetic view of human origins continued to grow in the early 20th century, even after the revival of Christianity. So Bernal looks at people like Wolfe, who wrote this preface to Homer, and Wolfe is interested in tracing Indo-European origins. He's interested in understanding what the Greek role in the origins of society was, and what strikes Bernal is that rather than looking to languages like Hebrew, and rather than looking to Semitic influences and Semitic language groups that might have influenced the Greek language, that Wolfe was interested in Homer. He was interested in Greek, right? He was interested in European origins to the detriment of other types of influence, the possibility of Semitic influences or North African influences on the Greek language, right? So he starts with Wolfe. He looks at people like Hegel, who talks about these evolution of history, where we start with Egypt, and then Greece is the cradle of Western civilization, leading to European society. That there's a linear progression. We can think of people like Auguste Comte, the idea of positivism in the 19th century, the idea of progress in the Industrial Revolution. So on and on, Bernal was finding reasons why 18th and 19th century European scholars were constructing a notion of their origins based on a Greek and Roman past. Beginning in Greece, not going back to Egypt, not looking at Semitic in the Near Eastern context for the emergence of Greece, but creating a kind of what was actually called a Greek miracle, right? That here was a culture that emerged, almost fully formed. It was a new culture, it was a baby, so to speak, but later Europeans would pick up on that, they'd find their origins in Greece, and they'd emerge victorious as the holders of wisdom and the holders of intellectual thought. Well, this was Bernal, and I'm not going to go into merits and demerits of Bernal's thought, arguments for and against Bernal's thought. that's not really so important for me here. What is important for me here is the interest of the impact that Bernal had, first in the United States. That is, Bernal's thought was attractive to a lot of scholars. And in a little while, I want to show you an example that he has of Apollo's origin in Africa in the third volume in 2006. Here was an idea I found when doing research that had already been very much part of African-American journals, journals of African-American history, journals of African-American literature. From the 60s and 70s, African-American writers were already writing about Apollo's Egyptian origins. But we'll get to that example in a little while. So in the States, I think the context for this has to, you really have to think again about the civil rights movement, right? So that from as early as '54 with Brown versus Board of Education, and 1955 with the lynching of Emmett Till, all the way up to 1968 with Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, there's kind of a paradigm shift in the States, right? And part of this has to do with questions of education, right? What's the proper way to educate new integrated American society? What kinds of texts should you learn in class, should you read in class? What kinds of paradigms of your own origin should be part of your education, right? And what we began to find from as early as 1970 with, and I'll try to find the pointer if this is working, I don't think it is, but you can see that without me pointing. On the left-hand side is the book Before Color Prejudice, which was written in '70 by a man named Frank Snowden. And what was interesting about this book was that for the first time, Snowden was looking for, again, origins of a society that got along, that didn't have racial tensions, that didn't look at blacks per se, for example, as less than, didn't look at skin color or phenotype as a mark of inferiority, right? That the Greeks, Snowden argued, saw color, they saw difference in terms of race, they saw difference at least in terms of phenotype, but they didn't equate that to inferiority, right? So what I want to say here is that this was a context for Bernal's work, that the seeds were already being planted post-civil rights in the United States for a revisitation of this question of origins, another look at where we as Americans are from, right? And what paradigms we could hold for a new kind of integrated American society. On the right-hand side is Mary Lefkowitz' book, Not Out of Africa, How Afrocentrism Became an Excuse to Teach Myth as History. And what Bernal was pointing to in this book was that Bernal's work gave credibility, in a way, to a trend in scholarship called Afrocentrism that was already emerging in the 60s and 70s. With the rise of Black Studies departments in the 60s, we had scholars who were beginning to argue such things as, and I mean, this stuff goes back to the 1800s, actually. I mean, we can find paradigms and examples of Black thinkers in the 1800s who were arguing that, for example, Cleopatra was Black, or Socrates was Black, that the Greeks understood that their origins were in Africa and so forth, right? So the civil rights kind of fueled this kind of scholarship once again, and Bernal's argument was that Lefkowitz's argument was that Bernal was giving credence to this fringe in American university thought and American university life. It's funny because when I was in college, this book had made its splash, right? Bernal's book came out in '87. I started college in 1988. And the first publication of Not Out of Africa, Mary Lefkowitz's book, had a picture of the same bust with a Malcolm X hat on, with the black hat. Actually, Spike Lee's X, Malcolm X, had just come out around that time. And Spike Lee, to promote the movie, actually he ran out of money. Memory, things start coming back. Spike Lee ran out of money when he was making this film, and the studio wouldn't give him more money. So he started selling X hats. They were black hats with a white X in it for Malcolm X. And he was selling them, peddling them in New York. Actually, there's a store in Brooklyn, Spike Lee store. I don't know if it's still there, but it was there when I was in college. And he would sell these hats in the store. And this was the cover of Lefkowitz's book. It was the bust with the X hat and an X, not out of Africa. The X there for her was not, right? And the big word was, how we say not. I mean, that was the big word on the text, and then the others in small print. And in the internet age, I figured I'd be able to find this, but it's nowhere to be found anymore. And I think there's a good paper to be written on the rewriting or the re-presentation, the remarketing of Not Out of Africa, because I can't find this cover anywhere. But anyway, that was Mary Lefkowitz's book. So let's see. One thing that, this is kind of a little bit of a digression, but one thing that I want to make clear is that I think Bernal gave certain license, not only to Afrocentrism, not only to sort of what we might consider fringe trends in American academy, but he also gave a context for scholars who were more interested in challenging questions of European purity, challenging questions of European authority than previous generations had done in scholarship. And I have pointed to this before, that I just list a couple of scholars here, that if we think of works like Edith Hall's Inventing the Barbarian, where Hall takes the word of Edward Said, and I think she writes this work in around 89, and she argues that the idea of the Orient and the idea of Oriental as less than, as other, is actually traceable to Aeschylus's Persians. That for the first time in Aeschylus's Persians, we see a construction of other in Asia Minor. You guys probably all have read Iliad and Odyssey, right? In the Iliad, Troy is not Asia, right? I mean, the Trojans have the same practices as the Greeks. They're very similar to the Greeks. You don't think of them as other. The last book of the Iliad is this father Priam with his son Achilles, and he says, what, I kissed the hand of the man who killed my son. Right? What more holistic picture of war, what more sympathetic picture of the damage that war can do could you find? Not the case so much when you look at, Hall argues, not the case so much when you look at a work like the Persians, right? You begin to see stereotypes of what it means to be Persian, what it means to be other. So this kind of work, again, is in the same context. Think of a work like Paige Du Bois' Slaves and Other Objects, where for the first time we are concentrating in her work on the role and the place of slaves in society, place of slaves in museums, how we study slavery, how we look at slaves in Greece and Rome. Benjamin Isaac, who writes a book called The Invention of Racism in Ancient Greece. So again, there's a context for this sort of work in the States that's really full, really rich, and Bernal makes a splash in this context. If we shift to South America, I'm hard-pressed, and again, those who are in the room who do this work can help me, but I'm hard-pressed to find examples of a direct impact and citation of Bernal's work in bibliographies of Black conscious writers, say in Brazil. And yet, those writers in some way are part of a similar project as that of Bernal. I think of a scholar named Ordepi Serra, who is a classicist. He writes, his most recent book is a study of Oedipus, the Oedipus myths outside of Sophocles. He's interested in looking at myths where Oedipus doesn't kill lions and myths where Oedipus doesn't marry Jocasta. And he argues that there's a broader context for Oedipus that we forget. There was a Euripides Oedipus. There were other playwrights who treated the subject. And yet in the West, we sort of focus on this narrow aspect of the myth because of Sophocles and because of Freud's influence, that we think of the Oedipus myth in terms of this Freudian unconscious, this Freudian paradigm. Ordepi Serra, interestingly to me, also writes works on African practices, custom religious practices in Salvador Bahia. And I'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow in your myth class. He also has an anthropological study of Native Americans in Brazil, Native Indians in Brazil. So here's a scholar who seems to me, and when I talked to him in my last visit to Brazil in November, he clearly knew Martin Bernal, had read Martin Bernal in English, and had kind of absorbed this work, but took a lot of Bernal's claims for granted. Right? To him, it was evident. It was something that wasn't worth even really spending too much time on and thinking too much about. I also found that if we go to places like Argentina, Bernal's work does influence authors who are on the academic left, right? People who are concerned, for example, with the state of Indians in Argentina, for example, the Tobas Indians, who are on the fringe of European culture, on the fringe of Argentinian culture, have been almost eradicated in this society. I saw that Wu has a work called La Visión Europea del Mundo Afroasiático, and in that work, he cites Bernal ad nauseum, right? He understands Bernal's work. He's very much interested in what Bernal has to say. And then, again, similar to Ordepi Serra in Brazil, he's also writing on the New Urban Poor, a title of one of his articles, in Argentina. And he says that it would take far too long to describe all the violence, crimes, and fraud which landowners used to get rid of the Indians, whose lands they had taken away to enrich themselves, all of which, of course, ideologically justified the appeal to the most crude and shameful racism. Right? So here is a person who is conscious of a certain subaltern culture, a certain suppressed culture on the fringe of Argentina, on the border there with Brazil, and he's also reading Bernal, and he's also concerned about what Bernal has to say. So there was a context, it seems to me, for Bernal's work in certain places in Latin America and Brazil. So what Bernal's work is really doing, it seems to me, beyond its immediate arguments, is it's staging a cultural reorientation, right? The cultural orientation, motivations, objectives of who asks the questions and how those questions affect scholarship, right? What kinds of questions are we asking? What kinds of answers are we looking for? My assertion there raises a couple of issues with science, right? That if we're looking at how we view the past, what we're studying, we would think in terms of a scientific method, right? We ask general questions, we form hypotheses, we test those hypotheses. But what I was arguing here, and what I began to see, was Bernal has opened up the kinds of questions that we ask. And the best example I can think of from science is Viagra, right? Why do we spend so many dollars, scientific money, on the study of Viagra, right? That is, we can discover certain truths, but the questions we ask are very much influenced by our social structure and by our concerns and interests, right? So if we're interested in a person having an erection, let's just go on and say it, right? That we spend money and time investing in that, when on the other side, that same science could be used to find cures for cancer, or to find cures for leukemia, or cures for diabetes, other kinds of diseases, right? So that we're sort of socially and culturally driven to ask certain questions. And it's the same thing in scholarship. It seems to me that Bernal showed a context where we were asking different kinds of questions, right? That he opened it up. And it wasn't just Bernal, but he was part of what he actually calls an atmospheric determinism, right? That the context in which we ask questions really does affect what questions we're asking in the first place, right? And so just kind of hold on to that idea of Viagra, because I think that's the best example I can think of how society shapes science, right? And how our interests in society shape the questions we ask. So to wrap up this portion where we talk a little bit about Bernal in general and the issue of origins, what was interesting to me at this African Athena conference was that scholars began to actually ask the core question of why we're so obsessed with origins, right? That people had been doing research on Bernal for 20 years, and they'd been asking questions about whether or not his arguments were correct, right? Is he right? For example, in the example I'll give you in a second, that Apollo's origin was in Egypt. You know, was he right in his arguments? What methodology did he use, right? Why does he use, for example, Herodotus to make arguments about myth, when Herodotus, we know, is telling stories, right? He's not the kind of historian that we would think of in the 20th century, right? Why is he using Herodotus as any kind of source when Herodotus is using mythology as his source for the past, right? So scholars at this conference were actually finally asking the question of why we're so obsessed with origins. I don't have the answer to that, but that's, I think, central to what Bernal was doing and why Bernal's work was important. Just a couple more things on the states. One, again, I've been talking about this Apollo example, so might as well give it to you, right? Bernal argues that in the 19th century, there was no doubt that Apollo originated from the north. This theory was largely based on the traditions of the Hyperborean men and women associated with the god's cult at both Delphi and Delos. Hyperborean was generally taken to mean beyond the north wind. So here was a concept and an idea. You can find it in Joseph Fontaine-Rose's book, The Python, or in his book, The Delphic Oracle, right? In all of these books that were coming out in the 50s and 60s, there were arguments that Apollo's origins were in the north, that he was European. What Bernal does in this third volume is to argue that the linear B name Pion, which is the name we know for Apollo, we have it in linear B inscriptions, he says it's a byname of Horus in Egypt, the god of healer. The epithet Leukion is not the wolf, as we had all been told in Fontaine-Rose's book, but rather is linked to light, as in the lunar cycle, and as such, it has Eastern, Semitic, and Babylonian origins. In any event, he says, the look stem clearly indicates that from Homeric or pre-Homeric times, Apollo was associated with the calendar and heavenly lights, the sun and the moon. The Greeks called Horus, son of Osiris, Apollo. And on. He just so goes through pages and pages of these proofs. He says the Apollo who shoots from afar is Hor, or distant. And he says in Egyptian theology, Horus was the falcon high in the sky, swooping down on his victims. So here he sort of unearths the linguistics and makes a case for these origins. Again, here we have some examples of this issue in the States, right? It's easy to see how concerned corners of African American intellectual life latched on to Black Athena. The book was published in the States where debates about cultural origins were raging. Blacks in America, now armed with the work of an erudite European scholar, brought the idea of an African cultural origin to the main. In Brazil, as we'll see in a moment, such an assertion of Black identity was already elementary in a way that Americans had not and still have not accepted, right? So again, these images show us for example, Elizabeth Taylor. You guys all probably recognize a different Elizabeth Taylor, right? The woman with the crutch and in the wheelchair. And I mean, she was hot. I mean, people really loved Elizabeth Taylor. And here she is as Cleopatra in 1960. So here we had an American film casting Cleopatra in this light. And since then, there have been 2 or 3 films casting Cleopatra as Black, right? So again, in the States, it becomes this black-white dialogue. Right, there's a hyper-fabrication of origins so that in Black American thought, Cleopatra is Black, Socrates is Black, and so forth. And again, I'm just painting broad strokes here, right? And this is certainly not a view held in the main or that many African American scholars necessarily hold, but it's certainly sort of a popular view of Cleopatra, for example. Again, this Africa is an idyllic Africa. Why graft oneself to such an Africa? Well, because it was a place of kings and queens, it was a place of great glory, it's a place of great success, right? And one thing that Lefkowitz argued was that this was an issue of rooting oneself to a successful past, right? And again, Europeans were doing the same thing, right? Lefkowitz accuses African Americans of this, but what I hope to have shown a little bit was that Europeans were doing the same thing. European scholars were doing the same thing. They were as concerned with origins as, let's say, African American thinkers were. Moving to Brazil, we have a little bit of a problem. The first thing we have to ask, and we have some time, I'm not going to take too much more of your time, but there are a couple of things here on Brazil. One of the things we have to ask first is how we define the term Black groups in Brazil. I mean, in the States, it's pretty evident, right? We have these categories on census reports. I guess now we think in terms of biracialism and how Black is the person, or how not Black is the person, right? But we don't really have a problem of asserting racial identity in America, that there's Black, there's white, there's other. To talk about Black classicism in Brazil, we have to first confront a problem that is race, as understood in Brazil, is not the same as we understand it in the United States. In fact, my department head, Paul Dixon, is a scholar on Machado de Assis. Does anyone know Machado besides Thea? Machado was a mulatto. He was a descendant of slaves, and he was one of the first modernist, realist Brazilian authors. He wrote a series of really, really great novels. There's a novel called Dom Casmurro, which is an intrigue about a man and whether or not his wife has cheated on him. And it's written in a masterful way. He invokes Othello, he invokes all of these narrative standards. And he's Brazil's greatest author, right? I mean, he is to Brazil what Cervantes is to Spain. He is to Brazil what Shakespeare is to England and to the English-speaking world, really, right? And here he was a Black mulatto author who did not identify himself as such. He didn't identify himself as a racial being, right? And what my colleague Paul Dixon argues is that race in Brazil is an importation, right? It's brought in from the States, and it's post our civil rights movement, right? That watching us has led Brazilians to begin to think in terms of racial identity, right? And this begins, Paul would argue, Professor Dixon would argue, in the 70s. This I disagree with. And I actually had a dream about Paul last night, and he was very hostile to me. And I'm wondering, you know, I was wondering if it was my guilt about saying that. But Paul and I have talked, and he knows how I feel about this. But At the same time, I feel a certain guilt. Blackness in Brazil. These quotes are from a book called The Brazilians. And Professor Page says, many Brazilians have long clung to the belief that, to quote the author Enrico Versimo, 1945 dictum, they have no color problem. Brazil has no color problem. The descriptive expression they have proudly attached to the sanguine view of race relations in Brazil is racial democracy. And this view of racial democracy was first coined by Gilberto Freire. Gilberto Freire, the sociologist who wrote a book called Slaves and Masters, and a number of books on slavery and the way in which slave culture influenced Brazil and the broader Brazilian culture. And yet, there was this process in the early 20th century of whitening in Brazil. And Page continues and says that in 1923, a federal deputy would predict that the Negro in Brazil would disappear within 70 years, right? That by mixing with Europeans, by becoming part of the mainstream culture, blackness as race, blackness as a person's identity would disappear. So the Brazilian strategy, as early as Gilberto Freire was born in 1900, it was to appropriate blackness in the main, right? So aspects of black culture, the worship of certain deities in Africa, the cooking, the food, the dancing, the samba, right? All of this was to be appropriated in Brazil in the main, to the detriment of real black bodies, right? That the black bodies didn't matter. The black bodies were going to be assimilated. They were going to become like everyone else. It was going to be a melting pot. But Brazil could take aspects of this culture. There was an undeniable presence of Africa in Brazil. Remember, slavery in Brazil doesn't end until 1888. And when England in 1807 abolished slave trade and set laws against the trafficking of slaves, Brazil was importing slaves as contraband, right? They were smuggling slaves into the country. And slavery continues until 1888 in Brazil. Right? So you wake up in 1900s and blacks are all over the place in a way that they're not in the US. We have, census reports say 15% of the US population is black. Right? In Brazil, you've got to go into the double digit 50% and on, right? Because the presence is just so indelible. The mark is so indelible. Right? So it was impossible to deny an African presence in Brazil in the way that it might be denied in the States. Right? But you could kind of whiten the society, and the bodies could disappear in a way. Striking again that, and I know that you're not going to be able to read all of this quote, but Levi-Strauss, in his visit in the early 50s to Brazil, actually in the 40s, and he writes his work in the 50s, begins to, again, create a link between blackness and Brazil in the main. Brazil is cast as a kind of racial paradise, once again, as a tropical paradise, a place where blacks were on hilltops, singing and dancing, playing samba, and we just finished Carnival in Brazil, right? 2 days ago, right, was Carnival. And it's, again, a festival of samba and of dance and of all of this drumming and all of these African influences that are undeniable. So for Levi-Strauss, and these are quotes from his work, Tristes Tropiques, he says that he noticed the poor perched on hillsides where a population of Negroes clad in well-washed rags composed lively guitar melodies. And he talks about the favela dwellers, the ghetto dwellers, right, where blacks played guitars, blacks who at carnival time came down from the hills and invaded the towns. I feel that this lodged somehow in a consciousness, right, and that what year is it? Black Orpheus in 1956. There was a play called Orfeo de Conceição, and that play was adopted into a film in '59, and this film won Oscar for Best Foreign Film that year. The film is called Black Orpheus. And again, you can see the way in which Brazil is marketed to the world as a kind of black paradise, a racial paradise, where black culture is an indelible mark, but it's a mark that permeates the entire culture. It's their escape, right? Carnival is Brazilian escape. Let's take a break from you hearing me for a second, and let's take a look at the opening scene of Black Orpheus. And what I want you to look for here, again, is the parallel, the kind of interplay and the harmony between the quote and what you see on the image. I just want to make sure I get the cursor. might not work. Well, I don't think it's going to work. But trust me that the images correspond quite well with the quote, right? That you see these samba players, right, and dwellers in the favela in rags, but in nicely washed, clean rags, dancing around, and they're getting ready for carnival. A kid is flying a kite over the ghetto of Rio, over the favela in Rio, and it's again, it's an image of poverty, but it's also an image of celebration, of samba, of preparation for carnival, of festivity, notion of a paradise, a place you'd want to visit, right? And a place that is filled with these blacks who at some point came from Africa and are now part of the culture, they're part of Brazil. Anyway, I guess the question really was, what is the place of Bernal in this discourse? Where did Bernal fit into the discourse? And what was the legacy of Bernal here? Bernal's absence, it seems to me, from the discourse of what we might call Afrocentrism in places like Brazil is certainly due in part to the issue of cultural orientation. Here again, the notion of origins, cultural orientation. The relationship between national stories and subaltern stories or subcultural stories. In the United States, African origin is a fabrication. Cries of sellout notwithstanding, Ralph Ellison's idea that a black person in America is truly American and not African has some bearing here. Blacks in America who preserved and evolved aspects of an old world identity through music, storytelling, art, and so forth, bring blackness to the main. That is, it's a subculture, right? We think of jazz music or spirituals or the blues. These are things that were subculture, right? They were aspects of a slave culture that later influenced Southern culture and then urban culture, and they're finally brought into the main, right? Americans take it as their own eventually, but it's still understood as, in many cases, spiritual. If you think spiritual, you don't think of something that Europeans necessarily think of as their own, right? It's someone else's culture and we can challenge this, but it's different in Brazil. That the Brazil model represents the opposite model, right? By the first half of the 20th century, Brazilians in the main, like Gilberto Freire, understood their identity to be a mix of native, or at least this is the myth of racial paradise, that the Brazilian is a mix of native, Portuguese, and African cultures. European Brazilians appropriated aspects of each culture to form their own sense of national identity. Therefore, when blacks in Brazil move toward a sense of black pride, black identity, or black unity, they're in fact reappropriating something that is Brazilian, right? That is, by the early 20th century, Brazilians at large understand native African, Portuguese culture as their own, right? And I'll talk about this a little bit more in class tomorrow, but we find Europeans who show no phenological trace of African blood celebrate African deities, celebrate Iemanjá, go to the public festivals and see themselves, they'll say that their origins are of Yemanja, or their god is Omolu, right? That they understand Candomblé culture and aspects of African diaspora culture that found their way into Brazil as their own, in a way that I've not seen in the States, right? We don't find this in the States. Contrary to, again, my colleague Paul Dixon's assertion, this appropriation of Black identity, this appropriation of pride, is actually a reappropriation, right? I don't think it's an importation from the States post-Civil War, rather post-Civil Rights. It's modeled, it's shaped from what was in the culture prior to the 20th century. If we look, for example, at Brazilian Black movements, what the later 20th century movements tap into are such things as the quilombos, the runaway slave communities in Brazil, up to about 1695. Zumbi is a great hero who led a runaway community and lived in this community for decades prior to being defeated by the Portuguese. In the early 20th century, we can think of people like Floyd Merrill's book on Candomblé and Capoeira, where it is argued that we know these practices, these African practices, were outlawed, right? That Candomblé and Capoeira was illegal leading into the 20th century, for example. And people practiced these customs at risk of being put in jail. Right, so all of these things point to not a late appropriation in the late 20th century, but a long, ongoing sense of an African presence among Blacks. We don't have time to get into Brazilian history of the 20th century, but it is argued that these cultural aspects were repressed in the 1930s and on under Getúlio Vargas, a military dictator, and they were repressed for political reasons, and that these cultural practices re-emerged in the late 20th century. So that by the late 20th century, there are traditions of what are called cadernos negros. These are Black journals and Black literary societies, Black writing groups and so forth, and what's called quilomboji, which puts together the word quilombo from the 1600s and oji today. That is our runaway community now, today's runaway community. Right? So again, no direct influence of Bernal in this context, but a link, a context for reading Bernal and for thinking about Bernal and origins, right? That in Brazil, we don't have this two cultural origins of European or African, but a multiplicity of cultural origins. And I'll just sort of conclude here. In the end, we really, perhaps, should be asking how Brazil helps us in our reading of Bernal, rather than how Bernal fits into or influences Brazil. Firstly, the case of Brazil amplifies notions of cultural origin, with Brazilians positing a threefold rather than a binary model of origin. Secondly, Brazil is another paradigm of the tension between culture and politics. Again, think of culture being repressed under the military dictatorship, or that between national identities and subaltern ones, or subcultures. What is hidden in the black-white, or even in the black-white native tension, is that the idea of multiplicity of identities that go into these cultures. So when we talk, for example, of these multiplicities, we think of Asian influences, Latin influences, or even sublets or subgroups within these broader identities. That is, when we talk about Black identity, as we'll see tomorrow, when we talk about Blacks in Brazil, or when Bernal talks about Black Athena, what's being effaced for a sense of a united origin, for a sense of an African origin, for example. And when this Blackness in Brazil is brought to the fore as an identity, what's being effaced is the difference between Yoruba, for example, and Bantu, the difference between different ethnic groups that came over to Brazil and whose cultures mixed and became a sort of a sense of a united Black culture, right? So Blackness in and of itself can be broken down into a multiplicity of identities. Same thing with Native. Which Native culture are the Brazilians identifying as theirs? Are they identifying the Tupi-Guarani? Are they identifying the Tobas Indians, right? What Native, right? Again, we're talking about a multiplicity of identities that are conflated into one when we say Black, white, Brazilian, Black, white, and Native. So, why then the obsession with origins, right? If we know that the reality is one of multiplicity, of great difference, of variety, why the obsession with these simplistic, simple origins? This is perhaps a political, maybe a sociological question, maybe it's a cognitive one, but it's certainly one that I'm not going to be able to answer tonight. Thank you. I do want to actually, before you just leave you with that, one, just to kind of want to, I left one slide that really doesn't have a direct bearing on the lecture, but here is a Brazilian author from Sao Paulo. Lift high your drum voice and sing, people, rise up and touch the sky, the heights, the hearts of cruel men, your song of the African jungle, people, lift high your drum voice, that Ghanaian in your eyes. The man demands hymns to liberty, that the samba of your skin and the boom boom of your words, they are the Colombo that is reborn every day. They are the muted cry of liberation.